In the earlier video, we saw the general features and parts of the peritoneum having its layers as the outer parietal and the inner visceral layer, and the peritoneal cavity enclosed within the layers having the peritoneal fluid and the peritoneal folds. This video we will discuss about the peritoneal cavity and how it is being differentiated into two sacs. So having this longitudinal section of our body, we can see the abdominal cavity enclosed by the anterior and the posterior abdominal wall. The posterior abdominal wall having the vertebra, and this abdominal cavity is being lined inside by the serous membrane, that is the peritoneum. And the yellow dots seen in the posterior aspects are nothing but the growing organs developed from the primitive gut tube. So this is the embryological phase of the developing digestive system. So when the growth occurs more, the organ starts to enlarge and tries to push the peritoneal sac forward, taking a layer of the peritoneum over it. So what happens? The organs still increase in size and tries to push or indent the peritoneal sac forward, and thereby the peritoneum will be converted, or it will be transformed into two layers. One layer covering the anterior inner part of the anterior or anterolateral abdominal wall, and the inferior part forming the parietal peritoneum, and the layer which is taken by the viscera will form the visceral peritoneum, and the bilaminar or bilayered fold of the peritoneum is called as the peritoneal fold, which is suspending the peritoneal organs or the abdominal organs. So when we see the order of organs from above to below, by labeling it, we can see below the diaphragm is the developing liver. Below the liver we can see the stomach enclosed by the peritoneal layer, that is the visceral peritoneum. So below that we can see the transverse colon and the coils of small intestine. So in the coils of small intestine are enclosed by the peritoneal or the visceral layer, and it is suspended by the fold of peritoneum. There are three parts of small intestine, duodenum, jejunum and ileum. Among this, only the jejunum and ileum are enclosed by the visceral peritoneum, and it is suspended by the peritoneal fold. Duodenum will be a retroperitoneal organ which is placed along with the pancreas. So this is the pancreas here, which is again a retroperitoneal organ. So this picture is similar to the picture shown in our textbook, having again the liver, stomach, transverse colon and the coils of small intestine, which is enclosed by the visceral peritoneum. Now because of this developing organs, what happens? The potential space, that is the peritoneal cavity, will be reduced in size. Now the visceral peritoneum, which is covering the stomach, will send a diverticulum below as two layers. So that is labeled as the first layer and the second layer. So what happens to this first and second layer? It elongates downwards and it folds backwards. So the first layer will fold backward as the fourth layer, and the second layer will be folding backward as the third layer. So that means the first is continuous with the fourth layer and the second is continuous with the third layer. So these two layers will join the antero-inferior part of the visceral peritoneum of the transverse colon. So finally, by the process of zygosis, which we discussed in the earlier video, there will be fusion of the two layers, that is the third and the fourth layer of the diverticulum, that is elongating downwards from the stomach. It fuses with the visceral peritoneum of the transverse colon. So the second layer will become continuous with the third layer, and it encloses or it fuses with the upper layer of the transverse colon, and the first layer, which becomes continuous with the fourth layer, will be fused and becomes continuous with the antero-inferior part of the visceral peritoneum of the transverse colon. So in this way, what happens? The entire peritoneal cavity will be reduced into two important sacs. The part of the fold, that is the bilaminar fold, which is present between the liver and the stomach, is called as the lesser omentum, and the elongated fold below the stomach, which is 4 layer, first, second, third and fourth, is called as the greater omentum. After the development of this greater omentum and the lesser omentum, a small space will be produced, that is the peritoneal cavity, which is present behind the stomach and enclosed within the greater omentum and behind the liver will be a smaller space, and that space is called as the lesser sac, while the other part of the peritoneal cavity will be mentioned as the greater sac. To repeat, the space which is present behind the liver, the lesser omentum, the stomach, and the space enclosed within the layers of the greater omentum will be termed as the lesser sac, and the other part of the peritoneal cavity which is greater in size will be termed as the greater sac. Thus, the peritoneal cavity will be now reduced into two important sacs by the development of the omentum, that is the greater and the lesser omentum, and that is called as the greater sac and the lesser sac. Though these sacs are separate, yet they communicate with each other through an opening called as foramen of Winslow or the epibloic foramen. Foramen means opening. So it is present behind the right free margin of the lesser omentum. So I have shown as an arrow mark in the picture, which shows the position of the epibloic foramen present behind the free margin of the lesser omentum. So through this opening only, the lesser sac and the greater sac communicate with each other. Coming to the peritoneal force, these are bilayered folds of peritoneum which suspends the abdominal organs. Not only that, it also provides the mobility for the organs and keeps it in position. So it is developed from the visceral peritoneum. It also provides a conduit for the passage of the vessels and nerves to reach the organs and to supply it. So many peritoneal folds are present which are given different names according to the organs to which they are attached. So they are the lesser omentum, which attaches the liver and the stomach. Omentum means stomach. So lesser omentum is a small part of the peritoneal fold which attaches the liver and the stomach. The greater omentum is a larger fold of peritoneum which attaches the stomach with the transverse colon. So this fold is the mesentery that suspends the coils of the small intestine, and this one is the transverse mesocolon that suspends the transverse colon. Coming to the greater omentum. So greater omentum is 4-layered fold of peritoneum. We have already seen. So this peritoneal fold hangs from the stomach as a diverticulum. So it develops as 2 layers, first layer and second layer. How it forms? Now the stomach has 2 borders, that is lesser curvature and greater curvature. So this greater curvature is present inferiorly. The visceral peritoneum, which covers the superior and the inferior surface of the stomach, will suspend the peritoneum as a fold beneath. So that only forms the greater omentum. So it is formed as 2 layers, that is first layer and second layer, that hangs beneath the stomach, which continues behind or folds behind as the third and the fourth layer. The first layer continues as a fourth layer and gets attached to the visceral peritoneum covering the transverse colon and continues with the inferior layer of the transverse mesocolon. The second layer continues as the or folds backwards as the third layer and attaches to the visceral peritoneum of the transverse colon and continues as the superior layer of the transverse mesocolon. So within these layers only we saw that lesser sac is present. So lesser sac is also called as omental bursa because it is related to stomach. It is present behind the stomach. So it is a closed sac. So it is also called as omental bursa. So this omental bursa or the lesser sac is present within the layers of the greater omentum. But what happens in the pubertal age group, the second layer and the third layer will fuse with each other by a process called as zygosis, which we saw in the last video. The process of zygosis, through which the second and the third layer of the greater omentum will fuse with each other, and so the lesser sac will be reduced in size. So in the later ages of life or in the adult life, we have a smaller size of the lesser sac because of this fusion. So this yellow color structure is the greater omentum, which is yellowish in color because it contains adequate adipose tissue. Also it contains the milky spots. Okay, milky spots means nothing but it's an aggregation of macrophages which is present in the greater omentum, and because of this only it is called as the policeman of the abdomen. Because whenever there is any pathology that happens in the abdominal cavity, this omentum, greater omentum, will move towards that pathological part and tries to protect it or guard or plaster the pathology. So because of this only it is called as the policeman of abdomen. So the content of this greater omentum is the right and left gastroepibloic vessels. When we remove or when we take the greater omentum or lift the greater omentum, we will see the coils of the small intestine. So that means the greater omentum covers the coils of the small intestine. Next we'll see about the lesser omentum. Already I told that there is a one lesser curvature for the stomach. It is the superior border. So this lesser omentum is a bilayered or double layered peritoneal fold which attaches the liver, undersurface of the liver, to the lesser curvature of the stomach. Not only that, it also attaches to the first part of the duodenum. So stomach continues as the duodenum. So the stomach and the first part of duodenum gives the attachment to the lesser omentum. So this lesser omentum has a right margin and a left margin. See, this is the lesser omentum. So it has a left margin which is an attached margin, closed attached margin. But see the right margin which is shown as an arrow mark, it is a free margin. That means it is open. So behind that only the epibloic foramen or foramen of Winslow is present. So through this communication only we saw that greater sac and lesser sac were communicating. So just behind this right free margin we have three important structures. That is the portal vein, hepatic artery and the bile duct. Also along the lesser curvature, this lesser omentum between the folds, between the two layers, it contains the right and the left gastric vessels. So coming to the epibloic foramen, I just want to detail about this epibloic foramen. It is an opening present behind the right free margin of the lesser omentum as shown in this picture. So it is an opening, and see, I just want to tell the boundaries of the epibloic foramen. Okay. So anteriorly it is bounded by the right free margin of the lesser omentum, as we already saw. So this right free margin also contains hepatic artery, bile duct and portal vein. So all these things becomes the anterior relation for this opening. So posteriorly we have the IVC, and superiorly we have the liver, the undersurface of the liver. No? So inferiorly we have the first part of the duodenum. So in the other picture we can able to clearly see the boundaries of the epibloic foramen. So this is a cut section, okay, horizontal cut section, where we are able to see the inferior vena cava, the cut portion of the stomach, and just behind the stomach we have the lesser sac. So we are able to clearly see the boundaries of the epibloic foramen. So I am showing the arrow mark which denotes the epibloic foramen, where anteriorly you can see the right free margin of the lesser omentum containing those vessels, that is hepatic artery, bile duct and portal vein. Behind you have the inferior vena cava, and superiorly we have the liver which has been taken out because of the cut part, and inferiorly you have the duodenum. So this is about the epibloic foramen. The other peritoneal force includes the mesentery, transverse mesocolon and sigmoid mesocolon, who has an attached border or the root and the free border which encloses the respective viscera. The root of the mesentery is small in length, it is around only 15 cm long, while the free border is enormous and spreads like a fan to enclose the small intestine excluding the duodenum, and it is around 6 meters long. The transverse mesocolon is a horizontal fold of peritoneum and the sigmoid mesocolon is a triangular fold of peritoneum. There are also ligaments present. Those are just the extensions of the peritoneum which gets attached to the organs and gives support to the organs. So those ligaments are falciform ligament, coronary ligament which gets attached to the liver from the anterior abdominal wall, and gastrosplenic ligament attaches the spleen and the stomach. Also there is one more ligament where the diaphragm and the stomach is being connected, that is a gastrophrenic ligament. Linorenal ligament is the ligament which attaches the spleen to the kidney. So kidney is present posterior to the spleen. So spleen and kidney are connected by the linorenal ligament. Lastly, with respect to the peritoneal force, we will also see some peritoneal force present in the anterior abdominal wall related to the parietal peritoneum. Till now we were seeing that the peritoneal folds are formed from the visceral layer, but there are some folds which are also present in the parietal peritoneum that lines the inner surface of the anterior abdominal wall. Actually, falciform ligament is a fold which is developed from the parietal layer of the peritoneum. So you can see that falciform ligament which is attached, one end is attached to the umbilicus, the other end will go upwards and gets attached to the liver. So it is a ligament connecting the liver to keep the liver in position. Beneath the umbilicus there are three folds. There is one single median fold called as the median umbilical fold formed by the parietal peritoneum, which is formed that means that parietal peritoneum is covering one structure underneath, that is nothing but the urachus. So in the median plane there is one structure called as urachus, which is actually an embryological remnant. So this parietal peritoneum, when it covers the urachus, it forms one fold. That fold only is called as the median umbilical fold. You can see in the picture. On either side of the median umbilical fold there are two other folds. Those are called as medial umbilical folds. They are covering the umbilical arteries. Those are the remnants of the umbilical arteries present in the plaster to the anterior abdominal wall. So these are covered by the parietal peritoneum and forms a fold over it. So those folds are only called as the medial umbilical fold. Still laterally you have two more folds. Those are called as lateral umbilical fold. They are actually covering the inferior epigastric vessels which passes on the anterior abdominal wall just beneath the muscles. Okay, so this parietal peritoneum covers these vessels forming the lateral umbilical folds. So these are the different peritoneal folds and the ligaments that are formed from the peritoneum, which holds, suspends and keeps the abdominal organs in position, and also helps to pass the various vessels, nerves and lymphatics to reach the organs to supply it. The peritoneal disposition of the greater sac can be studied by tracing it vertically and horizontally to understand the layout of the greater sac. A vertical tracing can be done in the sagittal section of the abdominal cavity. Starting from the umbilicus, the parietal peritoneum lining the inner surface of anterior abdominal wall ascends upwards and covers the undersurface of the diaphragm. From the diaphragm, the parietal peritoneum reflects downwards as the falciform ligament. This ligament is attached to the midline of the anterior superior surface of the liver, dividing anatomically the liver into the right and left lobe. The falciform ligament has an anterior border which is attached to the midline of the anterior abdominal wall with the parietal peritoneum up to the umbilicus. The posterior border of the ligament is free. In the superior surface of the liver, the falciform ligament spreads on either side as a coronary ligament and triangular ligament, which covers the entire liver as a visceral peritoneum. From the inferior surface of the liver, that is from the porta hepatis, the visceral peritoneum is reflected downwards as the lesser omentum. This, on reaching the lesser curvature of the stomach, spreads as visceral peritoneum to cover the stomach, and on reaching the greater curvature, it reflects downwards as a greater omentum. The greater omentum folds backwards and gets fused with the visceral peritoneum of the transverse colon and continues as the transverse mesocolon. The superior layer of transverse mesocolon passes backwards to become the parietal peritoneum of the upper part of the posterior abdominal wall, which is also the posterior boundary for the lesser sac. This parietal peritoneum passes upwards, ascends upwards to reach the undersurface of the diaphragm and fuse with the parietal peritoneum of the diaphragm and the falciform ligament. The inferior layer of the transverse mesocolon passes backwards, descends downwards on the lower part of the posterior abdominal wall, then fuses with the mesentery. The lower layer of mesentery again throws backwards on the lower part of the posterior abdominal wall, then reaches the pelvic cavity. In males, the pelvic cavity has two important organs, anteriorly urinary bladder and posteriorly rectum. The parietal peritoneum lining the posterior abdominal wall in its lower part reaches the pelvic cavity, first covers anterior surface of the upper part of the rectum, then dips downwards, then covers the upper surface or the base of the urinary bladder, then reaches the lower part of the anterior abdominal wall and fuses with the parietal peritoneum of the lower part of the anterior abdominal wall. In case of males, between the rectum and the urinary bladder, the peritoneum dips downwards to form a pouch. This pouch is called as the rectovesical pouch. Vesicle means urinary bladder. So it is the rectovesical pouch, which is the most dependent pouch in the erect posture of males. In case of females, there are three organs in pelvic cavity: anteriorly urinary bladder, posteriorly rectum, and in between there is the uterus. So the parietal peritoneum covering the anterior surface of the rectum dips downwards and then covers the posterior surface and the upper part of the anterior surface of the uterus. Then it goes and covers the superior surface of the urinary bladder and then passes forwards to become fused to the parietal peritoneum of the lower abdominal wall. See, there is a pouch called as rectouterine pouch, which is the deepest pouch formed between the uterus and the rectum posteriorly. This is the deepest pouch formed in the females, and it is also called as the Douglas pouch, and it is the most dependent pouch in the erect posture of females. Anteriorly also there is a pouch formed between the uterus and the urinary bladder, and this is a little bit superficial pouch, and this is called as a vesicouterine pouch. Now on doing the horizontal tracing of the peritoneum of the greater sac, two sections can be taken to understand its tracing. One section taken above the transverse colon and the other section which is taken below the transverse colon. In the section seen above the transverse colon, we are able to see the liver, stomach, spleen on the left side, and posteriorly the kidneys are present. See, the parietal peritoneum on the anterior abdominal wall, it spreads forward and it becomes the falciform ligament, bilayered falciform ligament, which covers the entire liver. That can be evident in this section. So from the porta hepatis, see a small structure seen in the posterior aspect. From the porta hepatis, the lesser omentum is being spread to cover the entire stomach from the lesser curvature, and from the stomach one ligament, in this section one ligament is being thrown to reach the spleen. So this ligament is called as the gastrosplenic ligament because it connects the stomach and the spleen. So this ligament has a superior layer and an inferior layer. The superior layer covers the entire spleen and then forms one more ligament, a layer of one more ligament. That ligament is called as leno-renal ligament. So the leno-renal ligament attaches the spleen and the left kidney. So the superior layer of the gastrosplenic ligament, after covering the entire spleen, becomes one layer of the leno-renal ligament, and then again it laterally it passes and becomes continuous with the parietal peritoneum of the anterolateral abdominal wall. The inferior layer of the gastrosplenic ligament again continues as another layer of the lienorenal ligament, and it forms the posterior boundary of the lesser sac. See, the pink color portion is the lesser sac. So this layer of the lienorenal ligament passes backwards as a parietal peritoneum of the posterior abdominal wall, covering the kidneys, and becomes the posterior boundary of the lesser sac. Then it continues on the anterolateral wall as the parietal peritoneum. So in this way, the section above the transverse colon, we can easily understand the horizontal tracing of the peritoneum of greater sac. In the section seen below the transverse colon, that is below the umbilicus. So earlier we saw there are three folds formed in the midline. Below the umbilicus, medially median umbilical ligament, on either side two medial umbilical ligament, and laterally is the lateral umbilical ligament. So on these ligaments, what happens? The parietal peritoneum forms folds, forming median fold, medial fold, and lateral folds. Then after covering the anterior abdominal wall, it covers the lateral abdominal wall, then passes posteriorly to cover the ascending colon and descending colon, and continue as the mesentery to cover the small intestine. A small portion of the lesser sac is also seen here. So in this way, the horizontal tracing of the section seen below the transverse colon can also be done. So this concludes this video, and in the upcoming video we will see about the various compartments of the peritoneal cavity. Thank you.